My name is Pamela Zaballa, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the No More Foundation. Today, we will be talking about some of the challenges and opportunities of addressing gender-based violence in Africa. And for that, I am delighted to have with me Nana Otu Oyerte and Angela Muruli. So thank you so much for being here. As I said, the team is very excited. We're starting No More Week 2, so this is absolutely great to have you and being able to have this kind of conversation, discussion around some of the challenges and opportunities in Africa. But before we kind of get into it, let me first introduce you to everybody so everybody knows how amazing both of you are. Nana is a social activist and the executive director of Forward, the leading Africa diaspora for women's rights organizations in the UK, working to end multiple forms of violence against women and girls, including FGM. For over 30 years, Nana has championed gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights for African women and girls at multiple levels. She's a passionate advocate for ending child marriage, child motherhood, and nurturing young women's leadership, development, and well-being. Angela is a program analyst working on women's political empowerment for UN Women in the Nigerian office. Her work in women's rights began as a youth leader at the Foundation for Women's Health and Research Development, Forward, where under the Youth Speak Out program, she launched FGM, a cut from tradition. Angela is passionate about young women's leadership and advocacy and global development. In March 2019, she delivered a TED Talk at the London School of Economics entitled, "What's the Point? Small Movements to End Sexual and Gender-Based Violence." Given that Africa is such a vibrant and varied continent, can we just talk a little bit about some of the challenges that it faces when addressing gender-based violence? Angela.
Thanks, Pamela. So I think for me, one thing that I've learned working on gender-based violence, and certainly this came in my orientation when I was at Forward as a young leader, was, especially when you're looking at things like FGM, is this, this not even an idea, but the fact that GBV takes shape in, it may be similar in some places, but the reasons why it takes place can vary from region to region, even if you just look at language. So, you know, the fact that we're so diverse sometimes means that the reasons why some people, for example, are practicing harmful practices is slightly different to another region, even if it's exactly the same form of violence that we are observing. So I think that really, really conflates the issue, and it also makes it difficult because when people are so adamant that something is part of their culture, it's not just the harmful practice that you are addressing or that you are disrupting, but it's really a sense of identity. And I think that's what really makes it difficult. So on the one hand, when we have organizations like Forward, or for example, like the United Nations that's coming in to say FGM is wrong or child marriage is wrong, when we decide to paint it all with one brush or just have one approach, you get so many people who are immediately defensive and offended. And it doesn't allow for us to go to the root of the issue, which is human rights violations normally perpetrated against women and girls. So I would say that is a huge challenge. So even so, in Nigeria, we say our diversity is actually what makes us stronger. I think sometimes because it's such a huge continent, it does make it a bit more difficult to address GBV because of just how it presents, the diversity and how it presents.
Mm-hmm. I think really it's interesting, and what Angela has just said. If you're looking at the drivers of gender-based violence, and even the types of gender-based violence that we're talking about. In some communities, for example, economic violence is not seen as violence. Sometimes even emotional violence is not seen as violence. And when you talk to women, they actually say, actually, you know, it happens all the time, but I never see it that way. So we will say that common forms of violence like domestic abuse and, you know, rape and, you know, FGM, child marriage, but the nuances of the different forms sometimes is quite challenging for people to acknowledge. But a big challenge for me is the issue of legal framework. In order to address effectively gender-based violence, you actually have to have laws in place. But the laws at the same time, apart from sometimes being contradictory, just coming from Tanzania, you will see that it is okay for a 14-year-old girl to be married legally. There's been battles to change the law, but at the same time, if an 18-year-old girl is raped, it's statutory rape. So if that same girl is married, it's okay, she's married. You know, a girl under 18, if she's married, she's married. And a girl who is raped under 18 is supposed to be falls under statutory rape. So it's really very contradictory. Then there is also the fact that it's also because there is strong religious and customary laws. And a lot of the women that we would normally work with will be women in rural areas who would have their lives all surrounded by, you know, these customary norms and customary laws, which makes it very difficult to implement programs or even for the laws to work. So whilst we may have some laws on GBV, these laws sometimes are not comprehensive. So you very rarely see a law that looks at both FGM, domestic violence. They would all be separate. And so you're now vying for the different laws or legal frameworks that would help you to address it. So that's a challenge. And I think for me, the biggest issue is because of the entrenched patriarchal norms that places power and decision-making in the hands of men. So you come into a relationship, you don't have much decision-making powers. You, a girl in the home, you don't have decision-making powers. You really don't even have, you know, the agency to be able to voice things, you know, and that makes it challenging when you go into a relationship to be able to make changes, because in your own environment, you're seeing gender violence as normal. Maybe even your father is beating your mother all the time and it's accepted. So why is it that when you go into the relationship, you will also say no? So it's really all around you, you're seeing it and it's accepted. And if there is sanctions against it, I think it will send a message, but there's rarely sanctions against these forms of violence, unless when it is the most extreme. And you don't wait for the most extreme before you sort of raise your voice. So yeah, it's a big, big challenge, yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the role of governments? Because we're talking about legal structures that are being put in place. That seems to have been the issue in many other places where they've progressed more with these, right? They have started by either emergency services or creating new laws. But sometimes, obviously, the people who are making the laws, the patriarchal structure around the creation of those laws means that, you know, governments find it either more difficult or they're not coming precisely with, you know, meeting needs. But I guess that's part of what I would love to know, what have governments in a way started doing and recognizing the issue. But I'm also curious about, I started studying development when Millennium Development Goals were the thing, and now SDGs. Has the SDG movement helped to drive those governments into taking a bit more of action?
If you ask me the SDGs, there's a lot of rhetoric around SDGs, and we do need to move from the rhetoric to reality. But at the same time, you find that some governments have introduced, you know, laws. A legal framework is not the end in all. you have to make sure that the legislation, the judiciary system, the police are all very much aware and trained to be able to implement the laws. So if there is a law in place and you just go to the police to report, you'd expect that you will be treated right, you'll be given the necessary support. But access to justice is a huge problem. So in itself, access to justice, it means that it's a barrier to even where the laws are in place. The government has to make sure that in schools, there is adequate awareness raising, there is support for people who seek redress when their rights are violated or they experience domestic abuse or they experience rape. But the reality is that a lot of these issues come under the women's unit or the gender unit for that matter. So there isn't acceptance in wider. So health may not even be dealing with it. Education may not be dealing with it. And then it's in the gender unit, which is in itself almost always underfunded. So there needs to be budgeting. And we are talking about gender budgeting. You have to unpick what goes in the budget. I've just come from a place in Tanzania where there is a lovely violence against women and girls government initiative. But who is supposed to be implementing it? It's the NGOs. Yeah. If the NGOs don't coordinate and bring together the key players at the district level, it wouldn't happen because these programs are not resourced. So if you don't resource it, the reality is that you have to place your money where your budget is, isn't it? So yeah, that's a big issue. Yeah.
Angela, following that, actually, I mean, partnership work at a local level, is it working? There's been, as you know, there took a time for countries like the US, like the UK, to develop a community coordinated response models. And the question is that level of partnership working at the local level to deliver some types of service or lobbying for laws, and at the national level, is there also kind of an interchange between some of the countries about, we've done this or you're doing that, etc.?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. And actually, that's what I wanted to follow up on Nana's point, that actually it's one thing to have the laws, and then it's another thing to implement them. And then, of course, even before we get to implementing or having laws, we need people to draft them, and we need to have people who find this work relevant. So if I can just give like a bit of insight, last week in Nigeria, where we have amongst, the lowest representation of women in legislature, several gender bills were thrown out. These are bills to end violence against women and girls. These are bills to increase the representation of women in democratic leadership. So among some of the justification given is that they're not relevant, that these laws are not relevant. So of course they're not going to be relevant if to men who don't experience these atrocities. So why would they feel the need for them to be necessary? So the point I'm trying to drive home is that we really, in terms of actually getting these laws into state level, getting them, of course, to be implemented and domesticated at the national level, and then for them to trickle down, it's really important that we have people who represent those who are most affected by these atrocities, who are actually speaking to these legislative processes. And if you see the areas where these laws have actually been successfully put forward, you see that they have very strong women's rights movements. They have strong political will at the highest levels, which may or may not be influenced by key networks, such as, in our case, the Governor's Wives Forum, African Women Leaders Network. So those are really critical, having these kind of networks and having women, because when we talk about gender-based violence, of course, we're really talking about violence that happens, that is perpetrated by men on women most of the time. So we really need the voices of survivors and victims to implement these legislative processes and these lobbying and movement building processes in order for them to be successful and applicable to the lives of women and girls. And then just quickly, in terms of interchange between countries, I think we need more of that. But definitely what we have seen is where countries are able to have high levels of women's representation, for example, or really successful GBV policies, it reflects in the attitudes of society. So where, for example, in Senegal, they have quotas, or in Uganda, where they have quotas for women's representation, you see that they have automatically more women in leadership and representation. You see their attitudes towards who should be a leader are slightly different. And there's a great study, the Gender Equality Attitude Study, which shows the attitudes that people in society actually have towards gender-based violence. Is it okay for a man to hit his wife? Is it okay for a woman to be a leader? And then you reflect that with the statistics of who is in leadership, what are the incidences of violence, and they actually have there's a strong correlation. So I think it's really, we need to do more speaking to each other, especially for countries who are lagging behind in terms of their gender policies, so that we can actually we can change our attitudes and our norms, right? So that's what I would say to that.
And
can I add on this? Because I think the element of partnership and sharing is so valuable. Just last week, I was in Nairobi, where Girls Not Brides East Africa held its learning summit, where they brought together about 30 representatives from Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And it was a forum to share learning around the national partnerships working to end child marriage. So it was looking at what is working well, what are the strategies that are being adopted, what's progress, what's the evidence. And this was a mix of civil society, but also in Kenya in particular, we had government agencies, and they were sharing the experience of collaboration with the government, access to justice, working in schools. What was clear was that they had actually got very strategic platforms for bringing together multiple stakeholders to tackle the issue of child marriage. And in addition, they were now starting to also look at the other drivers of child marriage. So looking at issues around teenage pregnancy, where in some cases, if a girl gets pregnant, she's then forced to marry the perpetrator. In some cases too, you'll find that things like FGM becomes a precursor and a driver for child marriage, because once you have gone through FGM, you are assumed to be ready for marriage. And what was really exciting was that there was a lot of focus on youth engagement and working with young people. But they also talked about the challenges of partnerships, and at the local level, working together as partners. Different organizations will bring their different nuances into it. So their priority is not the bigger good, but what do I bring? I mean, my organization, and I'm going for education, I'm going for legal issues, I'm going for health. So it's not like, what do we need in order to be strategic? And so there are issues around partnership, working together as partnerships. Very often there's a lot of work given to either the lead agencies working in the partnerships, but most importantly, you would see that sometimes there isn't a lot of commitment. So there isn't commitment because people or staff who would attend the partnership do not have decision-making powers. So they will have to then go back to the organizations and decisions are not made. And so it's important that we understand that whilst partnerships and collaboration is central, we also have to recognize that due to funding, there's also a lot of competition. And so I'm not prepared to put everything on the table because I do need to also get my funding. So that's a big issue that we have. Yeah.
That is a global challenge, isn't it? the problem with partnerships and the need for funding, and you find that in the North and the South, just that all the kind of great intention that organizations have in principle, but actually their survival kind of almost goes before that, right? And everybody's competing for the same pot of money, that is never enough because the issue is so big. We're talking about the imposed funding that comes many times from the North with kind of a set of values or ideas that actually have been constructed by organizations that may be very far away from the reality of delivering on the ground. And I just wonder how much of that is a bit of a nuisance, really, to understand some of the issues on the ground, and maybe how that affects partnerships even.
I mean, I think in my experience, working with, perhaps now working for more intergovernmental organization, I found that actually some of the support that we get, because of course we're also funded by governments, it's actually quite broad, which would allow for flexibility here. I think perhaps maybe where there's a bottleneck is the support or the restrictions or flexibility that may or may not be given to organizations at the grassroots. And I really think that between the two technical levels, that's where we really need more conversation that's led by grassroots, as opposed to intermediary organizations, if that makes sense.
I'm always baffled, especially when I go to some of the Latin American countries and I see projects in the ground that we would never probably run in the US or never run in the UK, just because of our models of work have been really different. But actually those programs are highly effective. And I just wondered, Nana, you've been around recently, and Angela, through your work, if there's any programs that you have seen that you say, oh my God, I just wish that this was in London, or that, you know, this was in some other country, because, you know, it's working and it's effective.
I think I'd like to add a little bit more before I ask that question, because for me, there's also the whole challenge of short-term models of good practice, particularly, you know, you're looking at social norm change. I mean, gender-based violence, it's an entrenched practice in many communities in Africa, and it's deeply part of the social fabric. To be able to address that effectively, a one-year project, 2-year project clearly won't make a difference. We tend to have these kind of models of one-year project expecting you to start, and even by the time you actually get the money, you've got 3 months into the project of, you know, now thinking and talking, and before you even start implementing. So that in itself is problematic. We are seeing that there's a lot of grassroots-led activism. I was recently in Tanzania and met this young woman who had done research in the community, and based on what she found, she actually realized that there is a problem and I need to be part of the solution. So her problem and being part of that solution was really, how do I create a space? And I was amazed at the model that she was working, where it wasn't very much just providing grants to girls, but it's like the communities needed to also fund. The parents needed to pay for the lunch for the girls and pay for their transport for the girls. They will provide the technical support. What I'm seeing is there's a funding often doesn't build or strengthen capacity. It's very much project focused. So you come in with the aim that the organization already has capacity, and you're going to sort of work with them to implement. So there's very little capacity building in some of these programs. We at Forward, we recently been exploring the role of diaspora change makers. And we have found that there's been quite a lot of insights from the diaspora, African diaspora, who have been forced to lead on tackling FGM in Europe. And a lot of them have actually said, because of the way I'm working, I'm also going to go back to the communities to go and also impart some of my learning in Africa, where we will bring different stakeholders together at the community level, ensuring that either traditional cutters, religious leaders, chiefs, as well as governments are very much part of the conversation of change. And that is really what is needed. That multi-stakeholder approach is so strategic to bringing about change. But very often these things are not funded enough. And it does take a lot of time to bring different players together. And for me, these are some of the models. One of the models that I'm seeing in Europe that doesn't seem to be really on the ground is access to psychosocial support and addressing issues around secondary trauma, especially for either activists or organizations who are working on these issues. And I was in Tanzania, and we were going to do training on income generation, and the young women said, actually, we want training on psychosocial support because we don't have that. And we very often come back traumatized from hearing stories and seeing girls that we couldn't save or girls that we saved and were taken back into the community. And that then means that there is need for a lot of this psychosocial support. In Europe, we see that as part of the pattern of support, specialist services which provide holistic support, including, access to refuge, access to holistic support, and also enabling women to get back on their feet, empowerment, etc. But I think that's not done enough in Africa. And that's something that I really would want. A lot of the girls will tell you that, but we don't have a safe home to really take these girls. So even if we find the women who come to us, we can only talk to them, but we will not be able to provide the psychosocial. I know that in South Africa, they do provide that a lot, but I think, again, it's very limited in many parts of Africa, and we do need to explore why this is not part of the provision of care. So yes, there's a lot of advocacy, but what also needs to be done strongly is a provision of support for survivors.
No, that's amazing. And Angela, can we kind of start moving to opportunities? And I would love to talk about the role of youth in this. We have a young continent here. Is our future in our youth hands? Are they the game changers? And I would love to hear kind of both your thoughts on that. But Angela.
No, yes, absolutely. I think the future is in the youth's hands, and we've seen that mainly through the movements that have been born, especially out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we were experiencing such high rates of gender-based violence. So many of the movements that were drawing awareness on violence against women and girls were led by youth. They took place online when we weren't able to be out in public. And even when we had restrictions, people were still out on the streets. So I think the power of youth in actually calling out, not really having, I want to say a filter, but that's not to suggest that youth don't know how to conduct themselves diplomatically and strategically and tactfully. But it's really just this sense of impatience in terms of change. And I don't know if that's to do with the fact that we now live in a society whereby we have so much instant gratification, whether it's on social media or whatever, but youth are impatient for change. And I think we are so good at holding the old guard to account, and we've shown that we have strength in numbers, and a lot of gatekeepers don't like that. And unfortunately, many women and girls have actually paid for that with their lives. Many young men and boys have also paid for that with their lives. but it shows that we are committed, that we are a force to be reckoned with, and that, yes, we know we're more aware now, we're more socialized to the idea that, you know, men and women should live equally, that we should have equality between the genders. And yes, so I think we are the answer. But that's not to negate the power of intergenerational collaboration, which is so important. That's something that Forward champions, because we need an intergenerational front. We need the experiences of those who have gone before us, but we also need to recognize that the world that we're going into is going to be led by us. So we need also our experiences and our insights and our innovations. So that would be my take on that.
So I want to pick up on what Angela mentioned about innovation and creativity. And we recognize at Forward the power of young people, young women, to be able to utilize social media and different spaces around raising their voice and making a change in the lives of. But one of the things we also have to recognize, I mean, when it comes to gender-based violence, particularly issues like FGM, child marriage, you know, rape, young women are disproportionately affected. So it really is something that I will say that young women are now angry. And when we do actualization training, we say people are angry and people want a change. So I think that is really pushing the agenda for change, and it becomes an opportunity, building on their strengths and numbers, like you just said. We at Forward recent training in the Gambia, one of the young, I mean, we just brought together diverse young people. We had wanted to recruit 25. We had 94 applicants in the Gambia. Amazing. And we could only take 25. And the 25 were really selected based on the different things that they brought. And some of the final products, I mean, there was a very strong FGM song. I don't think very soon that's going to be a theme song for FGM because it was so powerful. We've also got young women who are now starting to actually say that we can work together. So there's a strong movement building. And I would say, yeah.
Sorry to cut you, but I think that young people leadership training is missing globally. That yes. kind of real focus on training young people up. I think many people that are starting to work in the space almost get trained in it because it's a job, yes. rather yes. than really bringing out the passion and that desire about what needs to be done and what needs to be done correctly. So I think yeah. that is quite interesting, and it's I think it's also, as I said, work that should be done in in the UK and the US, and so yeah. I commend you for that. I know you're really passionate about that. I'm also thinking about men. I'm not gonna, especially young men. What do you think? There's a big masculinity movement around about the role of men. How can they help? As fathers, as brothers, as sons who are seeing this. Is there momentum, do you feel, in some of the countries in Africa for this? Are we, are we a little bit away from that? Are we getting there? I would love to hear your thoughts, because as I said, that's also being very debated in other parts of the world.
We can't hope to advance any aspect of gender equality or gender equality at all without men on board, simply because a lot of these structures that we are up against are upheld by them. Yes, women can also be guilty of perpetuating patriarchal ideals, but ultimately so many of these men benefit from this, and if they can't address or accept their privilege, then we're going to have serious issues. So I think it's important for men to come on board and see this as a human rights issue. Also, I think for some men, it may be easier for them to see it as, oh, this could happen to my mom or my sister or whatever, but it's also really important for them to see that even that can be potentially problematic, in the sense that why does it have to be someone or something that is associated to you before you care? So I think it's just really important for men to get on board. We need more men as feminists, and we've had some really great case studies, and I'm sure Nana will touch on, men ending FGM and those networks. But for instance, in Nigeria, when we had COVID lockdowns, as we observed across the world, one of the programs or activities that we implemented was the He for She at Home campaign, which, so He for She is globally, it's a global solidarity movement for male allies to come on board on the movement on gender equality. But we did a campaign leveraging on the platforms of really influential men, so Nollywood actors, musicians, Afrobeats artists, and getting them to sort of just participate in a social media activation whereby they took pictures of themselves, like washing the dishes or preparing a meal or cleaning the house, just to draw awareness to this idea that it's not just a woman's role to participate in household activities. We need both men and women to contribute to a successful house, and in general, we need both men and women to participate to create a sustainable and an equal, a more economically prosperous world, because whatever happens in the home is also reflected in society. So I think it's really important for men to step up and to also, for themselves as well, disrupting harmful masculinities, for them to also see that they can participate in different roles within society. They don't just have to go for traditionally, and they shouldn't just go for traditionally male roles, whether that's jobs or whether that's their sense of dress, etc. So yes, we need male allies on board, and I'm really happy that we are living in a time where more men can say, yes, I'm a feminist, but we need a whole more of those male allies.
Critical mass. You need a critical mass of male allies in order to really shift these entrenched social norms. And it's important to also recognize that traditionally a lot of women spaces working on gender-based violence have really just been for women only, for and by women. And as a result of that, we have been reluctant to get men into our spaces. And it's also because in our normal history of getting men in your spaces, the men always take over. So you also have to recognize that leadership should be either shared or ensure that women's spaces are left for women. But seriously, we cannot just be talking to ourselves, to the converted, because at the end of the day, we want deep and a change, and sustained change would only come if men and women are working together. And for young men to have a different attitude and to really speak out. We had a program at Forward called, Men Speak Out. And it's really important that men speak out and not speak out alone, because, they are also affected. And a lot of the messages was that this is my issue too. So it's not just an issue for women. And traditionally, everything has been left for women to sort of carry the buck. And it's important that we bring men on board, but also men in influential positions, religious leaders, teachers, to speak out and to call out when violence is happening. So yes, men have to play a role, and we need to work alongside men. And, they call it break the bias, isn't it? Break the bias and ensure that we are getting both of us, to make that change that we all want to enjoy. Yeah.
Oh, indeed, I think that's kind of a global plea, and I think you're absolutely right. In creating a lot of the movements, women only at the beginning, and rightly so at the time, and there are many aspects of it that were important. I think it's one of those things. I always say that gender-based violence dynamics and solution for programs actually evolves, right? It's different. I started practicing almost 20 years ago. We didn't even, the internet just started. The set of dynamics now are completely different. So I think times are evolving, generations are evolving. Young people are so active right now, and that's women and men. That maybe that would have been different in, in the mid 90s. I guess to finish, I would love to ask you if you had to give one piece of advice on what can they do, how can they help, how what should they inform themselves with anybody who's actually seeing us today, what would that be? Angela.
If I may, I think one of the things that I recently heard that I thought was so powerful was getting men to read more books by women. And it was just a little experiment that I did. And again, this was brought to my attention based on earlier on, I was saying a legislator commenting on why the bills were thrown out said, oh, it's not relevant. Of course, it's not going to be relevant if you're not used to hearing the voices of women, if you're not used to hearing their experience. The person who actually made this comment, in fact, it was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She was talking about how one of her very close friends, who's a male, who's a feminist, he's a man, bought books. He bought Becoming, the book by Michelle Obama, for several of his female friends, and he was kind of, naively pleased with himself, and he told her, oh, I bought these books for all my friends, and he was like, well, why didn't you buy it for any of your male friends? Why didn't you buy Becoming for any of your male friends? And I think it's just something that people don't think about. And I recently also asked a couple of my male friends, I asked them, how many books do you own by women? And most of them couldn't say they actually have read or own a book by a woman. So what I would encourage any man listening, man or boy listening to this, is to enrich your library. Whatever you're reading, are you reading content that comes from women, that comes from women from, the global south, as it were, women of color, Black women, non-binary persons living with disabilities? Because when we don't think about, when we don't read their narratives, we of course immediately don't think they exist. And I think this is also very true of persons who don't live with disabilities. It's so easy to dismiss or not even think about the needs of persons living with disabilities, and I'm definitely at fault when it comes to that. So one simple thing you can do is literally buy a book by a female feminist author. Just read their perspectives and use that to enrich how you go about your daily life.
That's amazing advice. It's easy, it's effective, and it's great to follow. We're gonna make sure we promote that piece of advice around. There we go, trying to convince the world to do read female led books and stories that do represent all of us. Nana, what were you?
I mean, you know what I would push for. I mean, I would really push for, supporting young women's leadership forward. That's been our forte for the last 5 years, and it's really paying off. Amazingly, a lot of the young women that we've worked with have come through, moving on. In fact, I was in Tanzania, and one is running for political positions in the UK. We've seen some people go into. So it's important that we create spaces for young women to learn and come together and understand these issues, but also to look into themselves and see where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, and to build on that as they develop their leadership journey. Because we know that one day these young women are going to be the decision makers, are going to be the leaders, are going to be their mothers, and we want them to be strong. It was really exciting speaking to one of the young women that I just worked with, and she said, look, when we went into a partnership with her husband, she was very clear that, you know what, I've just had a baby, you need to focus on cooking. And he said, my mother will, does not really. And she said, look, your mother doesn't live with me. You cook and you learn how to cook. So make sure that, it was challenging and difficult, especially when his mother was there. But after a few things, the mother actually said, you know what? I didn't realize that my son cooks very well, So it's really, how do we build young women's agency and power collectively and individually to really shift these traditional norms? And without young women's leadership, it's really going to be challenging. But yes, we do need to have men. We haven't started working on men's leadership, but at Forward, we are promoting strongly young women's leadership. And some of them are actually now working with men to make a change. So I would push that as the way forward, and to create spaces, support us to make this a really global program of change in young women's leadership.
A young woman who has, gone through this training and has learned what she's able to do and just be inspired and given confidence is a complete game changer for her and her environment and the future. So it's also another kind of no-brainer. Let me thank you both very much for joining us during No More Week. As I said, we try to activate voices globally and talk about issues that are relevant to all of us. We are truly believe that some of the dynamics of gender-based violence, whilst they might be culturally, there might be culturally nuances, the forces that drive them tend to be very similar for us globally. And as a result, a lot of the problems that we face are very similar, from forming partnerships to issues with funding. And so there is always space to learn from others and the struggles that others are facing. So thank you very much. And we will now show you a video on Forward's Young Women's Leadership Program so we can all get inspired. Thank you very much.
Tuwezeshe Akina Dada is Swahili for Empowering Our Sisters. It is a feminist leadership program inspiring a generation of young African women to engage in activism against all forms of violence against women and girls. Through the one-year fellowship, young women build leadership skills, are mentored by established female leaders, and receive funding to initiate their own social action projects.
The Tuwezeshe program has been fundamental in improving my leadership skills because it gives you the time and space to really reflect on who you are as a leader and what feminist leadership means to you. Activists, and if you're going to reach outside of your sphere, how do you continue to connect? All too often, leadership forces you to constantly do, but there's never the space to think. Having this time to really reflect and just renew what that means to me has been really important.
For Tuwezeshe, it's more of a movement, a group of people. We are here with our mentors, we're here with implementing partners. It's a sisterhood, a movement. We are marching, we want our voices to be heard about equality and equity and to end gender-based violence.
And that really helped me develop as a leader, to know the strengths that I have as a woman.
Today, from some of the discussions that we've had, I have really grown as a feminist leader. I'm really seeing how important collaboration is, and also really understanding the power that I have as a woman to be able to access different spaces and to be able to use my voice as well. It's just like a safe space to just be, and just to know that, my ideas can grow here and I can just grow as a person as well.
Mobilize and organize, mentor and share.
The Tuwezeshe training teaches fellows practical leadership skills and equips them with confidence and resilience to become effective leaders.
We need it, like this.
It explores issues of identity, power and agency, patriarchy, violence against women and girls, women's rights, and strategies for social change.
That Tuwezeshe program was the beginning of my professional. When I went through the program, that's when I started my advocacy work. That's when I started, with the social action project. I started doing activism in my community, and since then a lot has changed.
Fellows go on to initiate their own social action projects, from community engagement initiatives and youth support programs to research and advocacy projects.
The things that we fight every day is FGM. We successfully seen the impact.
My social action project was called SANU, a group therapy program provided to 10 women of Black, African and Caribbean descent that have experienced a form of gender-based violence or emotional abuse in the past year.
My social action project is called Kiginge Chetu. That is a Swahili phase, which means online hub. People are experiencing the physical violence, the sexual violence, the marital rape, yet they cannot discuss this. So we offer a space and also online discussion where we can speak about these issues freely and our voices can be heard.
My social action project was about advocating against sexual harassment in institutions of higher learning. We did activities around doing advocacy to make sure that universities have sexual harassment policies, that also students have the knowledge that sexual harassment, first of all, is wrong, and just really having activities around making sure that we start the conversation around sexual harassment in the universities in Uganda.
Since launching in 2016, the Tuwezeshe programme has changed the lives of 180 young women across England, Wales, Scotland, Tanzania, Uganda and Somaliland.
It's a great feeling to see young people develop and grow to be strong ladies under my mentorship. It gives me an assurance that tomorrow is well catered for.
Just to see them bloom, to see them come out, to see them find their voice, to go from whispering to roaring. It's like, you know, my work here is done.
The most valuable aspect of being part of the Tuwezeshe program for me has been sisterhood, sisterhood, sisterhood.
I absolutely adore every single woman that I met on the training, and I'm still in touch with most of them now.
The most valuable thing for me on this Tuwezeshe program, I think the peer mentoring, people seeing things in you that you didn't see in yourself.
Somebody holding you accountable for what you're doing, somebody who can supervise your work. I think that is a very amazing thing.
This has really allowed me to, just rejuvenate in my activism and go back out there more powerful, ready to fight for what's right.